You've all met my real son, Caleb. My mother's voice cut through the warm chatter in the VFW hall like a blade through silk, her frail but deliberate hand resting on the shoulder of a tall, broad-shouldered man I'd never seen before, the word real stretching just long enough for heads to turn toward me, for whispers to form in the corners of the room, for the laughter from the buffet table to stall like an engine that had run out of gas. And in that suspended moment, surrounded by the faces of neighbors I'd known since childhood, faces that had seen me mow lawns at 12, haul bricks for Old Man Hutchins at 15, and come home from college in a suit I'd bought secondhand, just to make Mom proud. I felt every ounce of the weight she had just dropped on my chest. Caleb smiled faintly, a perfect politician's smile, as if my very existence was an inconvenience to be smoothed over, and I knew this was not an accident, not a slip of her aging tongue, but a deliberate strike. She had been waiting for an audience, and tonight she had it. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. The smell of stale coffee and lemon cake drifted up from the refreshments table, mingling with the scent of floor polish and faint cigarette smoke clinging to the coats hung by the door. It was late October in Shelby, Montana, the kind of small town where the wind never stops and the seasons seem to skip over spring, where people still wave to you from their trucks, even if they secretly despise you. And as my eyes met hers across the room, I thought about the one thing she didn't know I still had, the thing that had cost me years of my life and every ounce of self-control I possessed. And I knew in that instant I was not walking away from this quietly. My name is Daniel Ross. I'm 38 years old, and I've lived here in Shelby my entire life, except for the 8 years I spent out in Billings and later Missoula, scraping my way through jobs most people wouldn't take for a week. Roofing in the dead of summer, night shifts at the truck stop, hauling scrap in the bitter wind, until I finally landed a contract that turned into a business. And then another, and before long I was making more money than I'd ever imagined, enough to pay off my mother's mortgage, fix the roof, and cover every medical bill she'd ever worried about, because that's what you do for family, or at least that's what I thought. The symbolic piece of it all, though I didn't realize it in the moment, was the small brass compass my father had given me when I was 10. Just before he left and never came back. It had a hairline crack across the glass and the needle sometimes stuck. But he told me, "It'll always point you home if you know what home means." And I'd kept it in my glove box all these years. I noticed it that night as I drove to the hall, the last of the sunset bouncing off its face. But now, standing there in that room full of people pretending not to stare, I understood that maybe home was no longer a place I could trust. Caleb, with his perfect hair, his crisp shirt tucked into jeans that looked expensive, but worn just enough to feel casual, leaned toward my mother and whispered something that made her smile in that way she used to when I'd bring her fresh-baked bread from Murphy's Bakery. Back before she stopped answering my calls as quickly, before she started bringing Caleb to Sunday church instead of inviting me. The whispers started to harden into murmurs now, little nods toward me like pity was something you could hand out on paper plates, and I caught sight of Edna Miller by the punch bowl, giving me that tight-lipped shake of the head that said she didn't approve, but wouldn't step in, not with so many people watching. My mother raised her voice again, introducing Caleb to the Johnsons from down the road, saying how he'd come all the way from Spokane to help her manage the family property, and it clicked in my head. The land, the old family house, everything I'd poured money into, everything I'd kept afloat during the years she barely scraped by. The things she'd promised would be mine, someday, because I'd earned them, because I kept this family alive when no one else could. Now she was handing it to this stranger with a handshake and a smile. I don't know if it was the way the overhead lights buzzed or the sound of chairs scraping back as people moved to get a better look, but I felt suddenly outside of myself, as if I was watching the scene from above, taking in every angle, every smirk, every averted gaze. I walked toward them, my boots heavy on the scuffed floor, and I could feel the hush following me like a shadow. My mother's eyes flickered when she saw me approach, but she didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't even falter. Caleb extended his hand as if we were meeting for the first time at a polite dinner, but I didn't take it. I looked him straight in the eye and then back at her, waiting, and in that long, unbroken silence between us. I made my decision. She might think she'd just cut me out of my own life, but I was going to make sure she regretted every second of it. I didn't sleep that night, not really. Just lay there in the dark listening to the wind claw at the old cedar outside my bedroom window, watching the red digits of the clock bleed into the early hours, my mind replaying her words again and again like a loop I couldn't shut off. My real son, the way she'd emphasized it. The way Caleb had stood there soaking up the spotlight like he'd been cast in a role he'd been rehearsing for years. By dawn, I was out in the garage, sitting in the driver's seat of my truck with the engine off, staring at that cracked brass compass in the glove box, feeling its weight in my hand, reminding myself of the one card I still held. The thing they didn't know I had. Though I kept that thought tucked away like a lit match in a dry forest, knowing I couldn't strike it too soon. I drove into town, past the grain silos catching the first light, past Murphy's grocery, where they'd be rolling up the front shutters, and over to the diner, because if there was anywhere I could catch the first ripples of gossip, it would be over coffee and pancakes in that corner booth where the old ranchers sat every morning. Sure enough, the moment I walked in, conversation faltered just a fraction of a beat before picking back up, like a radio station losing signal and snapping back. "Heard about last night," a voice said from behind me, and I turned to see Tom Hartley, a guy I'd gone to school with and hadn't trusted much since he'd tried to sell me a rusted-out hay baler for twice its worth back in '09. He wore that too-easy grin that made him look like he was always about to tell a joke, and he slid into the booth across from me uninvited, leaning in like we were old war buddies. "Look," he said, "I know you and your mom have history, but Caleb's a good guy. I've done business with him in Spokane. He's talking about selling that land of hers, and maybe we could all work something out before it's on the market." I nodded, pretending to listen, but his words were slick, too rehearsed, and I knew right then he wasn't here for me. He was here for a piece of whatever deal Caleb was cooking. That was my first fake ally, right on schedule. Later that afternoon, when I went to the post office to check the P.O. box I kept for work, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years. Sarah Whitman, who used to live 2 doors down when we were kids, who'd moved away after her husband died in a logging accident. She hugged me before I could say a word, that kind of hug that lets you know it's not just out of habit, but out of knowing something of your pain, and she pulled back, looking me in the eye with the same steady gaze she'd had when we were 10 and she'd dared me to climb the water tower. "Danny," she said, "don't you let them walk over you. You've done more for that woman than anyone else ever would. I've got some things you might need to see." I didn't ask her what not then, but I knew she meant it. Sarah wasn't the type to bluff, and that made her my first genuine ally in this mess. Over the next week, the tension ratcheted up. Caleb started showing up at my mother's side everywhere, at church, at the feed store, even at the bank, and every time I'd catch snippets of conversation about restructuring assets and liquidating surplus land, words that felt like vultures circling above. Then came the small win. A letter from the county recorder's office confirming that the deed to one of the outlying parcels, the one with the old irrigation ditch and the cabin I'd restored myself, was still in my name alone, untouched by whatever backroom handshake they were working on. For about 12 hours that felt like hope, like I had a foothold in the landslide, but the next day, I got a call from my mother's lawyer, not mine, hers, telling me they'd found irregularities in the transfer paperwork from when she'd gifted me the cabin, and they were challenging it in court. It was a cold, gray morning, frost on the edges of the mailbox, and I remember standing there in my driveway with the phone to my ear, the metallic taste of anger rising in my mouth, thinking, this how it's going to be. They're not just taking what I've built, they're going to try to make me hand it over myself. 2 mornings after that call from her lawyer, I woke before dawn to the sound of the wind slamming against the siding, the kind of gusts that rattle the whole frame of the house, and I took it as a sign that the time for sitting still was over. I drove out to the cabin, the one they were so sure they could take from me, the one I'd gutted and rebuilt with my own hands, and I unlocked the cedar chest under the bed where I kept certain documents, the kind most people never think to keep: original bills of sale, notarized letters, a set of photographs dated and stamped back when film was the only way to prove a moment. And as I laid them out on the table, I realized just how neatly the threads wove together if you knew where to pull. The ticking clock was already running because the court date for the irregularities hearing had been set for exactly 30 days from now, and in this county, once something was filed, the gossip mill carried it faster than the sheriff's cruiser. I made a few calls that morning, quiet ones to people who owed me favors, old contractors, a surveyor I'd helped out of a jam years back, and each conversation ended the same way: keep this between us for now. Meanwhile, Caleb and my mother were doubling down on their little public parade, hosting what they called a family heritage luncheon at the Methodist church basement, where I knew half the point was to show everyone that Caleb was not just some guest, but the new figurehead of what they were calling our family legacy, as if I'd been nothing more than a placeholder until the real son arrived. Sarah came with me that day, not as a date, but as a kind of anchor. She had that quiet way of standing beside you that made the room seem less hostile, and while my mother was busy praising Caleb's fresh ideas for the land, Sarah slipped me a manila envelope under the table. Inside were copies of emails she'd intercepted. Not stolen, just printed from the community center's public computer, where Caleb had been careless. Emails between him and a developer in Spokane discussing how quickly they could flip the family property once my mother signed over full authority. The wording was slick but clear enough to anyone who knew real estate. They weren't preserving anything, they were prepping for a sale. That was clue number one, though I didn't react to it in the moment, just kept my expression flat as if I was still too tired to fight. Clue number two came a few days later when Tom Hartley, my earlier ally, called me to say Caleb had mentioned buying some of my company's equipment at a family discount once things were settled. I let Tom talk, feeding him just enough vague agreement that I knew he'd run back and repeat it to Caleb, planting the idea that I was resigned, that I'd roll over. The truth was, I'd already transferred ownership of that equipment to a separate LLC I'd formed years ago, the paperwork buried so deep in state records it would take them months to untangle. Every move I made now was about timing, about letting them think the ground was solid right before it gave way under their feet. My mother, meanwhile, seemed almost giddy, her calls to me now rare and clipped, always with Caleb's voice somewhere in the background, and when she finally invited me to Thanksgiving dinner, to clear the air, I knew exactly what that meant. They were going to spring some final maneuver, something they thought would end the game. I agreed without hesitation, my voice even, hiding the fact that in my head, I'd already set the trap to snap shut before dessert hit the table. Thanksgiving came in that brittle late November light that always made Shelby feel smaller. The fields stripped bare, the wind sharp enough to carry dust across the empty road as I drove toward my mother's house. The brass compass sitting on the passenger seat, where I'd placed it deliberately, the cracked glass catching bits of pale sun. The driveway was full, Caleb's truck front and center like a trophy, Tom Hartley's beat-up Ford shoved in at an angle, a couple of unfamiliar SUVs, I guessed, belonged to the Spokane developer or his people. And inside, the smell of turkey and cinnamon hit me first, followed quickly by the sound of laughter from the dining room, the kind of laughter that comes when people are already feeling victorious. My mother greeted me at the door with that practiced smile, Caleb at her shoulder, and within minutes we were seated at the long oak table, plates being passed, wine poured. Conversation was easy for them, all about plans for the property and a new chapter, until Caleb cleared his throat and produced a stack of papers from a leather folder, sliding them across to me with a flourish. "Daniel, we thought it'd be best to put all this in writing so there's no confusion," he said, the room quieting just enough for me to hear the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I didn't touch the papers, just glanced at the top page, a quitclaim deed for the cabin, among other assets, with a spot already highlighted for my signature. "It's in everyone's best interest," my mother added, her voice calm, almost rehearsed, and that was the moment I let the silence stretch until it felt like another presence in the room. Then I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small black recorder, setting it next to the compass on the table. I pressed play, and Caleb's voice filled the room, his exact words from those emails Sarah had given me, talking about flipping the property for a profit, about getting rid of dead weight, and with each sentence, I watched my mother's face drain of color. The developer's people shifted uncomfortably. Tom Hartley looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Then I pulled out the second piece, a certified copy of the deed for the cabin, recorded years before, with notarized proof that it had been transferred to my LLC, along with half the surrounding acreage. The irregularities they were banking on were nothing more than a clerical mismatch, already corrected with the county weeks ago. Caleb opened his mouth to argue, but I slid the compass toward him. "You know what this is?" I asked, my voice low. "It's the last thing my father gave me before he left. He told me it'd point me home if I knew what home meant. I think I finally do." I let the words hang before continuing, and home sure as hell isn't for sale. What I didn't tell them, but what the next part of my plan ensured, was that I'd already filed a petition to place the rest of my mother's estate under conservatorship, citing the recorded evidence of Caleb's intent to defraud her, a move that would freeze every major asset she had until a court hearing. Within 48 hours, every deal they'd been counting on would collapse. The first twist was seeing Caleb's confidence crumble as he realized he'd been outplayed in front of his own allies. The second came 2 weeks later, when the court granted the conservatorship and named me sole administrator of her affairs, effectively making me the gatekeeper of every penny he'd been chasing. By Christmas, Caleb was gone back to Spokane, his developer friend sending polite but final letters, Tom Hartley avoiding eye contact at the diner. My mother didn't speak to me for a while, and maybe that was for the best. Some wounds don't close, they just scar over, but every time I drove past the cabin and felt the compass in my pocket, I knew I'd done what I had to. Not just to keep what was mine, but to remind them, and myself, that loyalty isn't weakness, and when you betray it, you'd better be ready for the person you thought you could humiliate to come back with the wind at his back and the truth in his hands. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.